Don't talk to me, I don't believe a word. Don't try to make me feel alright.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
So we're rolling.
Yep, we're
so
rolling.
This is American Reckoning. This is our podcast. He's Aaron and I'm Paul. And we wanted to talk about Lincoln and the Confederate side of things, and so we have some questions that we're going to posit and kind of go back and forth. But I think what I really want to do is read this article, and this article is about it was written about 6 months ago in the SCV magazine, and it's titled "Were the Confederate States of America Invaded to End Slavery?" It's written by John Hann, who's a second lieutenant commander in the Alabama division. But I thought it was so good and so representative of the topic that we're trying to figure out for tonight's chat. And we'll talk about Lincoln a little bit as well, but I wanted to bring this up and kind of get through it. And he starts off like just kind of talking about the mainstream media today. And that's the thing about this show a lot. Everything has a relationship to what we call American Reckoning, right? Because we see the United States, our country, going downhill. I mean, it's already downhill, but faster than we're capable of pulling it back out of the depths. And this consistent theme of the central government, the huge behemoth of the Goliath of our American government today, and it's overwhelming everything. So anyway, let me start from there. But he says, in modern discussions of the war for Southern independence, the mainstream media and academia promote the narrative that the war was fought over this issue of slavery. The morally superior northern states, which is what is thought, fought to end slavery, while the pitiful southern states fought to keep slavery. And that's what you hear today ad nauseum everywhere. He says, however, is this narrative supported by the evidence of history? And then he goes on to give an example. In a court of law, evidence is presented to substantiate the guilt or innocence of an accused party. Then an impartial jury makes a decision based on that evidence. Today, like in a doctor's office or doctors or physicians, and there's a parallel to this with all this COVID vaccine nonsense, but today physicians practice evidence-based medicine, in which therapies are only used which have evidence they are effective and safe. It's not time, and so that's under that's we're going to bring some evidence to the table to kind of talk about this question about were the Confederate States invaded to end slavery. So part of the narrative today that's promoted out there is that the northern states invaded to end slavery. But what evidence is there that this is actually true? And so let's look at this. In the history of the United States prior to the War of Southern Independence, no major political party or presidential candidate ever proposed and campaigned on ending slavery in the states where it existed. This includes the presidential elections of 1860, in which Abraham Lincoln was elected president with less than 40% of the popular vote. And then he goes on to talking about the Republican platform of 1860, which consisted of 17 declarations stating that the position of the party stated the positions of the party on the day. And in declaration number 4 said that each state has the right to determine its own internal affairs, which would include slavery. This is the principle, of course, as we know, as states' rights. And it said Specifically, I quote, that the maintenance and violation of the rights of states, and especially the right of each state to order and control its own domestic institutions according to its own judgment exclusively, is essential to the balance of powers in which the perfection and endurance of our political fabric rests. And that was also quoted directly out of President Lincoln's first inaugural address in March of 1861. And then he goes on to say, quoting directly from Lincoln's inaugural speech on March the 4th, 1861. Again, remember, this is right a month before the Civil War, quote unquote, Civil War kicked off. But he delivered it and said that there's no desire or authority to end slavery in the states where it exists. He was quoted as saying, I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. Those are his words. I believe I have no right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. And in that same address, Lincoln endorsed an amendment to the Constitution which would prevent Congress from passing laws abolishing slavery. He said, I understand a proposed amendment to the Constitution, an amendment which I have not seen, has passed the Congress to the effect that the federal government shall never interfere with the domestic institution of the states, including that of persons held to service. Holding such a provision to now be implied constitutional law, I have no objection to its being made express and irrevocable. So the amendment to which Lincoln was referring to was known as the Corwin Amendment. And that was proposed by Thomas Corwin of Ohio, in which he said, no amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will give to Congress any power to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to service. And that amendment passed the House of Representatives on February the 28th, 1861, by a vote of 113 to 65, and in the Senate on March the 2nd, a few days later, by a vote of 24 to 12. And it passed that 2/3 majority vote for a constitutional amendment even. And let me point out that this vote passed despite the fact that the representatives and senators of the 7 deep states from the South were not, there's 7 senators that didn't even vote, and it still passed. Yep. Because remember, at the time, they had already left the Union, right?
Right, they were gone.
And then it was ratified. The amendment was ratified by Kentucky, Ohio, Rhode Island, Maryland, and Lincoln's own home state of Illinois. And then further ratification was ceased as the war went on. But so right there, leading off, right up to the forefront of the war, it had nothing to do with slavery. And then to further evidence came about pretty early on in the war. I mean, from the get-go, as early as July. And what happened was, in the article goes on, it says 2 Union generals issued proclamations freeing slaves in the areas under their command. President Lincoln revoked those proclamations of both of them, relieving one of his command. On July the 1st, 1861, President Lincoln appointed Major General John C. Fremont, commander of the Department of the West, based in St. Louis. 6 days later, on August 30, General Fremont issued an order freeing the slaves of any owner who will not swear allegiance to the Union. President Lincoln ordered Fremont to withdraw this order, but Fremont refused. Lincoln then revoked Fremont's order on September the 11th, and on November the 2nd, 1861, he was officially removed from command and was replaced by General David Hunter, one of his own division commanders. Now, that's interesting. Why the heck would Lincoln do that? If slavery was the reason for the war, why would he do something like this? So then General David Hunter is then transferred in March of 62 to command the Department of the South, comprised of Union troops occupying Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. On May the 5th, General Hunter issued an order note number 11, freeing all slaves in those states. Quote, slavery and martial law in a free country are altogether incompatible. The persons in these 3 states, Georgia, Florida, and South Carolina, heretofore held as slaves, are therefore declared forever free. By General Hunter. 2 weeks later, May the 19th, President Lincoln revoked that order. I can read on real quickly. Lincoln said, I, therefore, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, proclaim and declare that the government of the United States had no knowledge, information, or belief of such an intention on the part of General Hunter to issue such a proclamation. And further, that neither General Hunter nor any commander or person has been authorized by the government of the United States to make proclamations declaring the slaves of any state free, and that the supposed proclamation now in question, whether genuine or false, is altogether void so far as respects such declaration. This was in May 1862. So, still, not a big slavery cause thing going on here. Then further evidence, I'll go on here. The U.S. Congress passed what's called the Crittenden-Johnson Resolution on July the 25th, 1861. So let's back it up just a little bit here. Stating that the purpose of the war, I'll say this again, the purpose of the war was to restore the Union, and Congress had no interest in interfering with the internal affairs of the states, which would include slavery. Remember, for those of you who don't know, what was legal at that time? What was in the Constitution? Slavery. Right?
Right.
Right. This was also called the War Aims Resolution, and it went on, and I quote, this war is not being, and this is from the Congress, July the 25th, 1861. The war is already going on. They say, this war is not being waged in any spirit of oppression or for the purpose of conquest or subjugation or for the purpose of overthrowing or interfering with the established institutions of those states, but to defend and maintain the supremacy of the Constitution and to preserve the Union with all the dignity and rights of the several states unimpaired. And as soon as these objects are accomplished, the war ought to cease, unquote.
Right.
Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, liberal guy, abolitionist, right? The largest newspaper in the day, it was like the New York Times, an ardent abolitionist. He urged President Lincoln to take action to end slavery, right? On August 22nd, 1862, so now we're back to 1862, President Lincoln replied to Greeley with a letter saying he had no interest in freeing slaves, but would do what he thought effective in winning the war. So here we have Lincoln thinking it was nothing about slavery. We had the actual United States Constitution, Congress, and resolution in Congress saying it's not about slavery. He went on to say, my paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union and is not to either save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some or leaving others alone, I'd do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because it helps save the Union. So now, big time politics start to weave into this game pretty quickly. A month to the day after his letter to Greeley, September the 22nd, 1862, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation that was to take effect on January the 1st, 1863. The proclamation said it was a war measure and is only to take effect in states, quote, in rebellion. Therefore, it did not apply to the states in the Union which still held slaves. What were those states? Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, and New Jersey. New Jersey, too.
Yep.
Imagine that. That was on the first day of January, the year of our Lord, 1863. All persons held as slaves within, and this is a quote, held as slaves within a state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States shall be then thenceforward and forever free. The proclamation provided path for, it also provided a path for a Confederate state to return to the Union by electing representatives and senators to the U.S. Congress and not be affected by the proclamation. Of course, none accepted this. None of the states did. But think about that.
Right.
So they're giving the Confederate states and the representatives an out by joining back into the Union, and they can go ahead and keep their slaves.
Right. Well, yeah.
Right.
And
that's the effect of that.
Yeah, basically. And offers like that, I think were kind of went on throughout the war. You know, basically at any time, any of the states could have returned and kept their slaves if that was the issue. Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that.
Yeah, I mean, that was on the table. Yeah, and the South said, and again, the South, looking at this on purely principled terms of the Constitution and their rights, which had not been overturned at that point, did not take that very well. And if you'd even see one state, but they were completely adamant and diametrically opposed to that type of, coddling, because it was incorrect. Right. It was completely, disingenuous, and it was not constitutional as what was laid out. So I'll go on. Any state or the people thereof shall on that day be in good faith represented in the Congress of the United States, be members chosen thereto by elections, wherein a majority of qualified voters of each state shall have participated, and shall, in the absence of strong countervailing testimony, be deemed conclusive evidence that such state and the people thereof are not then in rebellion against the United States. And then it goes on to list the state of Tennessee and, different areas of New Orleans, Louisiana, like New Orleans, 48 counties in Virginia, which eventually would be West Virginia, and then Norfolk and Portsmouth. And so, yeah, and I'll point this out. West Virginia was admitted to the Union on June 20, 1863, about six months after the Emancipation Proclamation took effect. Guess what kind of state? Slave or non-slave?
Slave state.
It was a slave state. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Huh. What's all this business about no new territories being slave states and all that? And here it was basically practically an annexation of half of Virginia. Yeah. And they make it a slave state.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Anyway, I'll go on. The Hampton Roads Conference was a conference held on February the 5th, 1865, at the request of the Confederate government, seeking resolution to the war. President Lincoln and Secretary of State William Seward represented the Union, while Vice President Alexander Stephens, Assistant Secretary of War John Campbell, and Senator Robert Hunter represented the Confederacy. The Southerners sought recognition of the Confederate States of America, but Lincoln was adamant the Southern states should rejoin the Union. At that time, the 13th Amendment had passed Congress, but was in the process of ratification. Secretary Stewart offered the Southern states, in returning to the Union, that they'd be eligible to vote in the ratification process and prevent it from becoming part of the Constitution. The only outcome of the Hampton Roads Conference was an agreement on prisoner exchange, ultimately. Slavery in the Union ended only with the ratification of the 13th officially on December the 6th, 1865, 8 months after the war ended. So there's no evidence the Confederacy was invaded to end slavery in those Southern states. The available evidence is completely to the contrary. The Southern states were not invaded to end slavery. So that's one aspect of it when we talk about Lincoln's own words, the Congress's own words, and then certain peace negotiations as this sort of went through, and the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed nobody. So why were the southern states invaded to end slavery? So let's look at the other part of this, and that is throughout human history, wars are fought for money, right, and power. Rarely, if in fact it's not even really, it's almost unheard of that they're fought over moral issues. Right. And the author points this out. The War of Southern Independence being no different. And as evidence of that, let's look at the money, because you talk about money and power, right? Right. Which is the real reason for this whole debacle. Slavery being a moral issue. We all accept slavery as terrible, but it's also a part of human history.
Right.
But and he writes, in 1860, the economy of the southern states was the fourth largest in the world. Let me repeat that. In 1860, the economy of the southern states alone was the fourth largest in the world. The U.S. Census of 1860 asked respondents to list the value of their real estate and personal property. This revealed the average Southerner had twice the wealth, more than twice the wealth, some $1,300 on average per person than in the North at $558. Mississippi was the state with the greatest per capita wealth in the country. Arkansas was the southern state with the lowest. Yet it was actually greater than Connecticut, which was the northern state with the greatest per capita. 335 southern counties had greater per capita wealth than the wealthiest northern county. It gives a list here. I'll just briefly list it out. But the top 11, the top 12, or get this: Mississippi, South Carolina, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, Texas, Florida, Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky, Arkansas. The top 12. The next one is Connecticut, New Jersey, Oregon, Maryland, Delaware, Massachusetts, Missouri. New York is number 20.
Yeah.
Just to kind of give you an indication. Then Michigan, Wisconsin, and some of the others. That is right out of Lee Saltow, Men and Wealth, United States, 1850, 1870, Yale University Press, 1975. So you can check on it yourself. So as the author goes on, as a society based on agriculture, the South manufactured few of the goods it needed. With greater wealth than the northern counterparts, Southerners eagerly imported European goods, which were of higher quality and lower cost than northern-made goods. And Britain was a major purchaser of Southern cotton. If anybody knows at that time in the 1850s and 1860s, and prior to that, Great Britain was a huge textile manufacturing company, industry in that realm, and relied heavily on Southern cotton. In 1860, and this is where we start getting into the percentages, which is really important to know. In 1860, 90% of the federal government revenue came from tariffs. It's also known as customs or duties, imposts, and also excise taxes, 90%. The remaining 10% came from the sale of land. Approximately 75% of tariff revenue, so 75% of that tariff revenue came from the southern states. This meant 2/3 of the federal revenue came from the South. Loss of the southern states would mean loss of this revenue. Tariffs were a source of contention between South and North almost from the beginning of the country at the founding. Southerners considered tariffs unfair, largely because they fell most heavily on the southern states. Mm-hmm. This was exacerbated when tariffs were enacted to promote industry in the northern states. So not only were they taking this new basically tax revenue into this central government, they were spending the money up north, of course, because that's where the representation was. And just real quickly, the author goes through all of the history of the tariffs right here. 1789, you had the Hamilton tariff, was a 5% rate on all imports. That was the first tariff, Hamilton. 1816, what's called the Dallas tariff, which was a protective tariff at 25% rate on woolens and 35% rate on iron. 1824, a sectional tariff on iron, wool, and cotton. 1828, a tariff, the abominations, the protective tariff, 38% rate on 92% of imported goods. That's sickening. It resulted in what's called the nullification crisis when the South Carolina refused to collect it at Charleston Harbor. They said the hell with it. Even back then, they were getting disgusted at this. The crisis ended when the tariff rates were lowered in 1833. And then again, that same year, the tariff rate were reduced down to 25%. So you had a real problem. 1842, the black tariff, protective tariff rates increased from 20 to 40%. So they're trying to knock it back up again. 1846, the Walker tariff rates reduced from 32 back down to 25. So here you have a battle of representation in the House, you can imagine, and the Senate. And then finally, the last tariff leading up to the war, tariff was at its lowest in 1857. And I think James Buchanan was president at that time as well, a Democrat. Anyway, fast forward up to 1860. And there's a reason that we go through this, because it's important to see how this tariff issue was so vital to the Republican Party and Lincoln at that time. In Declaration number 12, the 1860 Republican Party platform, it called for an increase. This is their platform, an increase in tariff rates to support growing industry at a time when the vast majority of industry was in the northern states. Quote, that while providing revenue for the support of the general government by duties upon imports, sound policy requires an adjustment of these imports as to encourage the development of industrial interests, unquote. The Morrill tariff, proposed by Representative Justin Smith Morrill of Vermont, called for a 70% increase in tariff rates on dutiable imports. 70%.
All to protect northern manufacturing.
And I looked at this and I said, who is this dude? Justin Smith Morrill of Vermont. And I looked at the state of Vermont from that list, and I'm like, what the heck kind of imports does Vermont deal with?
Exactly.
What do they? Where is this dude coming from? Vermont. Vermont doesn't even border a freaking ocean. I mean, I could see this coming from New York or Boston, which, you know, had manufacturing merchants and manufacturing in their ports, harbors and so on. But Vermont?
Yeah. So what's the motivation there?
Yeah. So anyway, 70% tariff increase from Vermont. The only thing they border is a wasteland to the north called Canada, which isn't really going on. Anyway, so I looked at that, and that's kind of interesting. The rates on goods imported by Southerners were higher than rates on goods imported by Northerners. We know this. The bill passed the House on May the 10th, 1860, by a vote of 105 to 64. Republicans in the House voted for the bill by an 89-2 margin. The bill was stalled in the Senate for a time, but then passed in that chamber on February the 20th, 1861, on a 25-14 party line vote. Of course, remember, the 7 deep states had seceded by this time, and their senators did not vote on this bill. So this is right on the verge of war. Here's February 2061. Now, we know the Morrill tariff was strongly supported by Abraham Lincoln in his campaign and strongly opposed in the South. And it's, in fact, this is a huge deal. In his first inaugural address, March 4th, 1861, President Lincoln said he would resort to force, if necessary, to collect the tariff. That's interesting. That's pretty hardcore.
Mm-hmm.
He said, the power confided in me will be used to hold, occupy, and possess the property and places belonging to the government and to collect the duties and imposts. But beyond what is necessary for these objects, there will be no invasion, no using of force against or among the people anywhere. So he was lying. In his April 19, 1861 proclamation announcing the blockade of southern ports, so now we're right around Sumter, President Lincoln said his reason for doing so was for the collection of revenue. Quote from Lincoln, whereas an insurrection against the government of the United States has broken out, and the laws of the United States for collection of the revenue cannot be effectually executed therein. And then again, On July the 4th, 1861, in an address to a joint session of the Congress, President Lincoln said his policies were only for the collection of revenue again. Quote, my policy sought only to hold onto the public places and property of the government and to collect the revenue, unquote. So the war's on, leading up to it, and now we're fully into the war, and he's still saying that's
right.
So we brought up the money issue now, in addition to the political side. The author goes on to say that not all the southern states seceded at the same time. Virginia, of course, as well as North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas initially voted against secession, right?
Right.
However, when President Lincoln called for an invasion of the southern states because of this, which they considered an absolute violation of the Constitution, those four states then voted to secede. Prior to the secession, Virginia sent a delegation to Washington seeking resolution to the dispute between the Union and Confederacy. Colonel John Baldwin was a member of that delegation. Colonel Baldwin related that in a private meeting with President Lincoln, the president was urged to let the then seven states of the Confederacy go in peace. According to Colonel Baldwin, President Lincoln's reply was a concern for revenue. And this is the big quote. What then will become of my tariff? Yeah. And I don't think Lincoln had any illusion going to war for money. This was a war for money. But I do also believe, I think, you know, I don't know what you think, Aaron, but it's lining up that this was Lincoln wanted this situation. Republicans in the Congress and other politicians and merchants and industrial interests in the North wanted this war because they were getting ready to lose a bunch of money that probably Lincoln and some backdoor and the rest of these nitwits had promised them in this thing we call mercantilism and this ability to use money collected from the collection of revenue,
right,
tariffs to use to spend on industrial interests like building railroads,
right,
which we would find later in Reconstruction was exactly what they were doing.
Yep.
But I think at this time, and maybe I don't think anybody would know, but I think Lincoln probably had no friggin' clue the hell he was getting ready to unleash.
Yeah.
In terms of the destruction and death that would ensue.
Yeah. I've heard some historians comment on how it seems like Lincoln didn't really understand even how big the country actually was. And so he underestimated a lot of things. But yeah, he was certainly dogged, and he certainly engineered the start of the war pretty much. But yeah, like it says, the North had representational advantage in government, and they were, doing, and there were a lot of scandals. I don't know if the article brings this up at any point, but there were a lot of scandals regarding what was called at the time internal improvements. These days, it's completely common to have, governments build canals and all that kind of thing. Back then, a lot of people don't realize the vast majority of roads were private. When these major public works projects were done, they were done privately. The whole idea that the government would do these things, was just kind of not considered, a normal thing. And so what was happening was you had these scandals that ended up happening where basically the government would, like it says, most of its money came from the South. Then they would give some of this money to some of these northern states to do some internal improvement projects that would end up, in scandal where, the whole project would get ripped off by some, con man. And, and so they were hearing about this in the South, and it was outrageous to them, and, the reason
they had grown up thinking that, hey, that's unconstitutional. These internal improvements, like Madison had originally said, these are unconstitutional. What are you doing?
Yeah.
They believed in the original intent. In fact, the author does go into that here, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
The one other thing, the reason for these tariffs wasn't just so that they could get money. I mean, they were protectionist, and that's what a lot of people don't realize. You did have a largely agrarian South, and they would rather have bought their supplies, like it says, from Europe. But the whole point for these tariffs was to make it more expensive to buy things from Europe, so that Southerners would have to buy all their supplies from Northern manufacturers. The South was pretty was very, very free market inclined, believe it or not. And with the secession, the North lost the port of New Orleans. Later on, they lost when they lost Virginia, they lost the ports there. But yeah, those were big collection points, like it says. They still had a few in the North, but just a huge chunk of what they had before was gone. I mean, seriously, most of it, most of the money they made was just completely gone with those states leaving. It's a huge motivator. It's totally true. But yeah, people, see, New York now, or they see Chicago now. And, back then, those were still pretty serious places, but they, like it says, the two most wealthy states in the Union, I think, before the World War, I could have this wrong. It was Louisiana and Virginia, I thought.
Oh, in the South. I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
It was Louisiana.
Actually, in the whole, before the secession, in the whole country, I'm saying, before secession.
Mississippi, and what was the other one? Let's see. South Carolina, which of course you had the Mississippi River at the mouth there, and you had South Carolina with Charleston and so on. Then it was Louisiana, so you have New Orleans there.
Yep. Anyway, go on.
So the article goes on here because it does hit on. You mentioned internal improvements, and he does cover that a little bit here. But he asked the question, why do the Southern states consider secession necessary, if not to save slavery? Right. It's a perfectly reasonable question.
Sure.
Logical.
Right.
The original 13 colonies were joined together under what was originally called the Articles of Confederation. So under this compact, which didn't last long, right? There was only one branch of government, what's called a unicameral Congress, in which each state had one vote. It's a simple arrangement for a simple time. Under this agreement, there was no guarantee if a state was attacked, the others would come to its defense. Also, states were competing with each other economically, placing tariffs on goods imported from sister states and that sort of thing. Representatives of the 13 sovereign and independent states came together to then revise the articles, but instead produced an entirely new agreement. We all know that as the United States Constitution. This established the central government, that the central government would guarantee the security of each state and prevent a state from creating barriers of trade with others. That was the main motivation for the states to come together to protect their money and trade and for security.
Right.
With the French still around, and the shortly after this huge war with England, obviously we needed those guarantees.
Right.
That's Absolutely. Where they're coming from. President James Madison is known as the father of the Constitution because he was heavily involved in the creation of that agreement. He also was the author of more than a third of the Federalist Papers, arguing that ratification of the Constitution by the state of New York. It's unlikely anyone had more knowledge of the Constitution and its purpose than Madison. In 1817, Madison vetoed a bill which was the brainchild of Henry Clay, political mentor of Abraham Lincoln. The bill President Madison vetoed is known as the Bonus Bill of 1817, since there was a surplus of federal revenue. And let me say that the bill called for the federal funding of what's called internal improvements, building canals and roads and improving waterways in the U.S., President Madison, in the U.S., President Madison, in his veto message, said of internal improvements are not among the powers granted to Congress in the Constitution, and thus he vetoed it. It was actually written, in his words, the legislative powers vested in Congress are specified and enumerated in the 8th section of the first article of the Constitution, and it does not appear the power to be exercised by this bill. That exercise by this bill is among the enumerated powers. And he was right. In 1860, with a commanding majority of Congress, the northern states were voting to spend most of the federal revenue to develop industry in those their own northern states. The General Welfare Clause of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution requires federal spending to be for the benefit of all the states, not just one or a group.
Right.
Quote from the Constitution in writing, the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. Although approximately 2/3 of federal revenue was generated from the southern states, remember, we said, right? 75 to 80% of federal spending was in northern states for the same type of internal improvements that this was in 1860, the same internal improvements that President Madison said violated the Constitution.
Right.
So all the spending, well, not all, but the vast majority was slated to go to the northern states. By assuming powers not granted to it by Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, the federal government dominated by northern states also violated the 10th Amendment. Quote, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people, quoted directly from the Constitution. Some northern states were refusing to return persons held to labor of service as required by Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution. No person held to labor of service in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up upon claim of the party to whom such service or labor is due, quoted and endorsed by Lincoln in his first inaugural address. The Constitution is a compact among states to create a central government for their mutual benefit. This agreement was being violated when the northern states became dominant in the central government. These violations then benefited the northern states at the expense of the southern states. Therefore, the southern states decided to withdraw from the union created by that compact.
Yes.
We'll bring this up much later we'll get into a whole nother discussion about secession or about this, what will relate it to any contract or divorce.
Right.
You know, this is a principal human right. If you enter into something, you can't be forced to stay into that contract.
Right.
You can break a contract.
Right.
If it becomes abusive or, every contract I've ever seen, it gives you 30 days or 60 days, or as long as you give notice, even in real estate, you see it all the time. You got a chance to get out of it.
Well, yeah. Contracts, if one party is in breach of contract, and I think that's the claim here, that these northern states were violating the contract. And so the Southerners like, all right, well, then the deal's off, which is a completely reasonable thing to do.
So the next biggie, we talked about the money, we talked about the tariffs, talked about some of the other factors here real quickly. But we start with the relationship between the states and the central government. We kind of give the author gives historical evidence of that. And he starts with the Declaration of Independence. Every person has rights that come from the Creator, the author goes on. All men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. The purpose of government is to protect the rights people already possess.
Right. To
secure, quote the Declaration again, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, not by government. If a government does not protect the rights of the people can change or even abolish the government and create a new one. Yes. Quote from the Constitution or the Declaration. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Each colony, and reading on his article, each colony is now to be regarded as a free and independent state. And then the declaration that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. And that as free and independent states, they have full power to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And then he gives, and I'll end with just a couple more things here when it talks about evidence of states' rights, that this was of the people in their sovereign states, and they have the power to decide, not the government, those sovereign states. And he goes on to bring up these examples here. Articles of Confederation, November 17, 1777. Each state retains its sovereignty, its freedom and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not in this confederation expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled. This also comes out in the Treaty of Paris on September 3rd, 1783. And here's Great Britain acknowledging this. This treaty, the formal end of the War of American Independence, each colony is recognized individually and by name as a free, sovereign, and independent state. Here's what His Majesty Britannic said. His Britannic Majesty acknowledges the said United States, viz. New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, Providence Plantations, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, is to be free, sovereign, and independent states. Then the Constitution, of course, 1787. And this is why words matter, because Lincoln knew this.
Yeah.
President Lincoln made the argument that since the first paragraph of the Constitution, its preamble, basically, it's the preamble, begins with "we the people."
Right. That means
the Constitution is right. The Constitution is a compact of the people as a whole and not the states. In the draft approved by the Constitutional Convention, the states were listed individually and by name, they were in the Treaty of Paris in 1783. It would be awkward, however, if a named state refused to ratify and then join the Union, remaining independent. Therefore, what the Committee on Style removed, they actually removed the names of the states and replaced them with "we the people." Lincoln used this play on words to his benefit, and it's sickening. However, the Constitution became effective. Remember, the Constitution only became effective only when ratified by 9 of the 13 states. It wasn't like some governmental blown out of your butt. It was the 9 states out of 13.
Right.
It were states. When George Washington was inaugurated April 30, 1789, there were only 11 states represented in the Congress. North Carolina, Rhode Island did not join the Union until after his inauguration. Since the states created the federal government, it is the states which are represented in the legislature of the central government. In one chamber, the House, each state is represented by a number of representatives based on its population, Article 1, Section 2. In the other chamber, the Senate, each state is represented by 2 senators, Article 1, Section 3. Since the states created the central government, it is the states that choose the chief executive, the president of that government. For this purpose, each state has a number of votes equal to its representation of the federal government. The legislature of the state is to determine how the electors are to be appointed, Article 2, Section 1. The states are the parties to the agreement which created the central government. Therefore, that agreement can only be altered with the agreement of 3/4 of the states. He goes on a bit here and talks about the Virginia Resolution and the Kentucky resolutions of the late 1700s, but I'm not going to go into that. And then a little bit on the Supreme Court. But I mean, that's you know, you can get into, you know, I saw somebody continue to say, uh, sorry, talk about Alexander Stevens in the Cornerstone speech, and you know, I mentioned slavery and this and that, and of course, what they're doing is very very akin to what Lincoln did, and that is taking something out of context
Right.
that was not what he was legally speaking, and out of context, even in his words, was not what was the subject of the matter with the
Right.
Cornerstones.
Well,
And
yeah,
so,
you know, I mean, it's very easy for people to use that kind of evidence and try and simplify such a complicated thing down. But yeah, it's a very interesting article because it makes the statement that, you know, things must be in evidence. You know, I remember when I started to wake up to this kind of thing, it's because I was learning more of these things. And, you know, the whole slavery issue, you know, one of the things I like to say to people is, because I believe it's true, you know, that war or some conflict would have happened anyway, even if slavery weren't a part of it. It might have happened later, and it would certainly have been much different. But I mean, people think
yeah,
that people have
it could
no
happen in
idea about
it could happen in
anything.
2030.
Right, right. But the whole point is people have no idea that there was anything else going on in slavery. You know, uh, it's really interesting how when we like look at the past and we look at these conflicts and we look at these, you know, issues that existed at various points in history, we have this idea that there was nothing else going on in people's lives, you know, and that
Right.
everybody was just walking around, you know, thinking about the one issue we remember the time for, and don't realize there was regular old life going on that was very complicated, and just like it is today. It's not, you know, people think those were simpler times. They weren't simpler times. No time was ever simpler. You know,
Yeah.
human beings have always been as complicated as they are now. I mean, information travels a lot faster now. You know, there's certain things, but it's still a complicated thing. I would like it, you know, if sometimes I would like it if information traveled only as fast as a horse. You know, it's give me a lot more time to adjust to the world, but you know, it's a trade-off. But point being, yeah, I mean, there was a ton of gripes that the sections had with each other that went back to the founding pretty much.
Mhm.
And that is so in evidence once you start to dig into this kind of thing, and people just, you know, assume because, you know, basically everybody, you know, most people go to a government school, you know, that's in some way funded by the federal government these days. And so obviously, you know, I mean, you know, you grow up thinking, you know, going through school, learning in your history classes that the United States has been on the right side of every issue ever, you know, pretty much, you know, there's you don't really, I mean, once you get into academia, you know, if you become an academic, yeah, you know, then, you know, you can start to criticize history and really all that kind of thing. But the average understanding is the United States has made the right move every time, you know, especially during the so-called Civil War. And it's just amazing how untrue that seems to be when you get into the evidence.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, the frustrating thing to see is our country is suffering greatly because of it. And you see this rise of acceptance of communism, of
Right.
this is how our country is. It's fine. It's cool. Communism's okay. You know,
Well, that's a failure of people to learn from history, and it's a failure really of uh people that know history to teach it properly too. You know, I don't think all of this stuff about the Soviet Union was made up. You know, it's pretty clearly in evidence, not just from us, but many other countries around the world saw the types of terrible things that would happen under those regimes, whether it was the Soviet Union or whether it was uh you know, what happened in Vietnam or Cambodia. You know, I mean, this people, how can you have a better life under a dictatorship? because that's what it is. It may be a committee,
But the thing is that they're getting a glorification of this and an acceptance that the central government is the rightful holder of power, and right. We're better off as a nation, not as a state, but as a nation, and more secure and more wealthy or whatever. But that's going to backfire. It's just going to metastasize. It's going to grow. And then the worst case scenarios is what's really happening is, and I think it was like Karl Marx, what did he say? If you can cut the people off from their history, then they can be easily persuaded.
Right.
So if you see instances, and then we bring up the war between the states, where the central government, the central authority, in this case through Lincoln and the Republican Party at the time, their power, their wealth is growing through the increase of the central government. And, that history is being cut off. Those, you have to really dig down deep. And when the word is the emotional thing of racism and slavery and white supremacy and all this other stuff gets charged at you, people don't want to talk about. They clam up.
Yeah.
And so the truth is knocked down and hidden so easily when those charges are levied.
Yeah.
And it's like, and it's working. It is so effective. And it's so sad.
And a big part of that is because most people really don't care about history. I've mentioned this to you before, guys like you and I, we're really into history in a lot of different ways. We find it interesting. It gives us perspective on, we learn lessons from the past, all those types of things. But yeah, most people really aren't history fans. It's like I've said, it has, I'm sure, the history genre of things for people to be interested in. I'm sure it has less market share than the NFL. You know what I mean? Just for example, you know what I'm saying?
No,
So that's the thing. So a lot of people really don't care about these things, but they are put upon to have some type of perspective on it. And so you can imagine a thing that a person doesn't care about is not something he's probably going to put that much effort into, and it's going to be lazy. And so people, I think, it's easy to do that, not just because of how, it's been so eroded these days, but just because in general, people are more or less, they just react to things. But they really don't have a historical perspective on things.
There was one last thing with respect to what people thought about Lincoln's invasion, and then what progressed in northern newspapers even at the time. And I was looking at Thomas DiLorenzo's book, The Real Lincoln, and he lists out what was being said in the northern press at the time about, and then it got into this discussion about secession. And most of the northern states said, go, it's constitutional. Hey, let them go. It's fine. Exactly. But Lincoln, and that was the main motivation. Lincoln did not want them to leave the Union. He did not want them to leave the United States because there was a lot of money involved.
Yeah. It's
always about that money and the power and the control and who has it.
Yep.
And it was no different in this war. And so I'll go over a few of these, and then I want to tee it up for the next time when I'd love to talk about secession and the reasons for secession, how it's in the Constitution, and how it applies even today. And you heard California and other states really wanting secession, and it's still just as prescient today. And I think, and then we talk about the size of government and how we'd be a lot better off with much smaller forms of government since we've gotten so big. When we're talking about representation in the Congress, and how one freaking Congress person is now on average in charge of 1 million people or whatever.
750,000. Yeah.
So, it's just gotten out of control. So we'll get into all those things, but let me read a couple quotes here.
Sure.
And this is leading up to the war. And then, these are all again, evidence. This is from their northern public opinion and the northern media at the time. From Albany, it says, and this was in November 1860, we sympathize with and justify the South because the rights have been invaded to the extreme. If they wish to secede, quote, we wish them Godspeed. The Chicago Daily Times, November 21, 1860, quote, like it or not, the Cotton States will secede, and Southerners will regain their, quote, sense of independence and honor. Concord, Connecticut, or Concord, New Hampshire, I'm not sure, Democratic Standard, November 24, 1860, appealed for concession of the just rights of the others of our Southern brethren. The New York Journal of Commerce, November 1860, condemned the meddlesome spirit of the Northerners who wanted to seek to regulate and control people in other communities. Bangor Daily Union. The Union depends for its continuance on the free consent and will of the sovereign people of each state, and when that consent and will is withdrawn on either part, their union is gone.
Yeah.
A state coerced to remain in the union is a subject province and can never be a co-equal member of the American Union. Brooklyn Daily Eagle. Any violation of the Constitution by the general government deliberately persisted in would relieve the state or states injured by such violation from all legal and moral obligations to remain in the Union or yield obedience to the federal government. Let them go. Another New York paper. Cincinnati, November 1860. Southern states should be permitted to, quote, work out their salvation and destruction in their own way, rather than to attempt through forcible coercion to save them in spite of themselves. So they didn't like them, but they said, okay, well, just let them go.
Yeah.
Another paper, Davenport, Iowa. The leading and most influential papers of the Union believe that any state of the Union has a right to secede. Providence, Rhode Island, Evening Press, November 1860. Sovereignty necessarily includes that we call the right of secession. That this right must be maintained lest we establish a colossal despotism. Isn't that predictive? Against which the founding fathers uttered their solemn warnings. I mean, it goes on and on and on.
Well, and it makes me
New
wonder.
York Tribune. If here's the New York Tribune again. Sorry, let me just finish these real quick. And if tyranny and despotism justified the revolution of 1776, then, quote, we do not see why it would not justify the secession of 5 million Southrons from the federal union in 1861.
Right.
So if it was right in 1770, what's the problem?
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
the New York Tribune, the largest newspaper in the country.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and those founding times were still all, barely, but still within living memory at the time.
And then in 1861, again, New York Tribune, Lincoln's latest speech contained, quote, the arguments of the tyrant, force, compulsion, and power. 9 out of 10 people of the North are opposed to forcing South Carolina to remain in the Union.
Right.
The great principle embodied by Jefferson in the Declaration is that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Therefore, if the Southern states want to secede, they have a clear right to do so.
Yeah. And it makes me wonder how many of these newspapers were the ones that Lincoln forcibly shut down. Because he did shut down sent soldiers to shut down a lot of newspapers. Of course, not the ones that he had ownership interest in. People don't realize that.
He shut down. He shut down quite a few. I mean,
I haven't actually read.
Here's one. Let me read this one real quick, and then this is the New York Evening Day. It wrote on April 17, 1861, right after Fort Sumter, that the event at Fort Sumter, quote, a cunningly devised scheme. And this is what I was talking about earlier, that it's contrived. And they say that it's contrived, quote, to arouse and, if possible, exasperate the Northern people against the South. Look at the facts, said the Providence Daily Post. For 3 weeks, the administration newspapers have been assuring us that Fort Sumter would be abandoned. But Lincoln, this is quotes, saw an opportunity to inaugurate civil war without appearing in the character of the aggressor. He goaded Jefferson Davis to attack that.
Yep.
He said that no food was going to come, right? No food. And then they sent a little boat over there and they fired on it.
Right. Yeah, hindsight's
So, I mean,
20/20,
people keep saying this Fort Sumter crap. If they'd only look at the real evidence,
yeah,
they would see the real reason for invading the South.
Well,
was money and power, and that's what Lincoln was.
And that's one of the problems with looking at it, looking at it today. United States has a reputation to maintain, and the problem is the evidence really is so overwhelming if you really look at it and see it for what it is. I mean, it is so overwhelming, and a lot of people are just stubborn. A lot of people don't care about history, but there are some who do, or claim to, or like to use history in their talking points, and they simply refuse to see the evidence. And really, that war ended up being so terrible. Still the worst war we ever fought in the U.S. As far as people killed. But it ended up being such a high price that it would be very hard to look back and say, oh yeah, the tariffs were worth it. You know what I mean? They have to kind of assign this high and mighty, ideal that they were chasing to it. I mean, they almost have to do that. Because if you don't do that, it really is pretty something that really can make you lose faith in your country. So it's not surprising it's taught the way it is, and it's not surprising that people just refuse to see the evidence. I mean, seriously, I mean, when it's plain as day, they refuse to recognize what it means.
Well, it's because they have an agenda. There is a complete takeover going on, and which is a whole nother subject we'll get into. But it has its origins. This is nothing new. It's all about power and who has it, the philosophy of government, and what our founding fathers tried to impart. That, at least when you talk about the Civil War, the war between the states, as we call it, that was very clear and known to both sides. I just read a bunch of quotes from Lincoln himself. It was known on both sides that this thing had nothing, and that the modern view, the Marxist view, the one that they want to silence people on, is to make sure that this is about slavery, that this is all about slavery, that you're racist, that you're white supremacist, that you're evil. So shut up, take your stupid monuments down and your memorials.
Right.
We're going to erase you. And that is a Marxist tenet. That is what they want.
Yeah.
And I challenge anybody. That is exactly what is going on. And people had better wake up, or you're really going to see what Marxism is. You're really going to see what communism is. All you idiots out there who think you're freaking badass with the freaking communist thing. Yeah. You have no idea what's coming.
It's dictatorship. It's dictatorship.
And all you dipheads, I hope you don't wait. I hope you don't wait until the butt pain is so bad that you have to rebel, because then there won't be anybody left to be with you. You have to do it legally. You have to do it and fight back locally, and younger people have to get involved and get off their damn phones and whatever.
Well, they're comfortable now.
I get emotional about it because it is. I see it so plainly. I've talked about this train coming that you just can't seem to stop.
It's like excruciating. Yeah, it's like you see this train wreck happening in slow motion, and it's like there's nothing you can do about it. it really, I understand that sense of frustration. But like you said, it's going to have to get painful for people before they'll really start to pay attention. And the problem with that is that could be at a point where it's going to be very difficult to recover from, you know.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, a lot of people think it's unrecoverable from the 1865 and Reconstruction. I mean,
yeah,
just,
I mean, and I'm
before that even. I mean, it was on its way, but it really.
And realistically, it's probably unrecoverable. I mean, that war, the so-called Civil War, did so much damage to the constitutional situation. I mean, it just trashed the Constitution. It just, you know, it broke every rule in order to, you know, do whatever it wanted to do. But yeah, the United States after was a different country. I mean, a real different country.
It's so sad because people even back then were realizing it, but it's almost like even back then they couldn't. Let's be honest. The Southerners realized it.
Yeah.
Okay. They realized that limited government, that freedom of the individual, that our values and principles came from God, that came from the natural state of man, and not the central government. So when they saw that, they were like, "Oh, hell no! Where's my rifle?" Do you understand? It wasn't about no damn slave. I guarantee you.
Yeah.
Where is my rifle?
Most Southerners didn't have
hell
slaves.
To the no! You're not coming down here to. And then the people today, they don't realize. You guys don't understand. The Southerners had it right. They were correct.
Yeah, they were. They were correct. No doubt about it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry. That's what it is. They were right.
Well,
they were right. I'm not saying they were right on
everything.
You know, elements of slavery and you know, you had racists everywhere, whatever. But
well, yeah, that's the other thing. People
in all sides, and especially in the North, the Northerners were more racist than the Southerners. The Southerners were actually. So if you want to talk about slavery, which we can,
well, and actually, a cool topic for another episode would be to what extent the Northern attitudes that were imported during Reconstruction contributed to Jim Crow. That would be an interesting topic.
Yeah.
Because the South was actually integrated until after the war. People don't realize that.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about that too, because there's so much at stake, and there's so many subjects, and we'll get through, you know, and try to apply this to today and American. That's why we call it American Reckoning, because of you know, American Reckoning over and over again.
A reckoning's coming
quite often.
Yeah, no good, man.
All right, man. Well,
good one today.